At dawn, July 29, 2025. West of Orikhiv, the ground shook as Russian armor surged forward. Reports and battlefield assessments show a heavy mechanized assault that day. Exact platform-by-platform kill counts remain unverified. What's clear is that by nightfall, wrecks smoldered across the fields and the momentum had stalled. 2 days later, the push had been broken. What turned a 40-tank advance into scattered hulks in under 48 hours? Stay with me. We'll separate what's verified from what's viral, and why the Leopard's kit matters tactically. Because to understand what came next, you need to picture that armored wave in motion. The assault that shook Zaporizhzhia was more than just another armored push. Accounts describe columns of dozens of tanks. Some reports estimate around 40, but numbers vary and remain unconfirmed. What everyone agrees on is that a broad front of Russian armor massed west of Orikhiv and began grinding toward Ukrainian defenses. On the surface, it looked like unstoppable weight in motion. From a distance, it appeared overwhelming. Long lines of tracked vehicles, turrets angled forward, dust hanging in the summer air. To observers, sheer pressure seemed bound to shatter the defenders positioned in that sector. The sight carried the same message Russian doctrine had relied upon for decades. If you bring enough steel, the line must eventually give. But the environment itself complicated that idea. The Zaporizhzhia steppe offered little concealment beyond thin tree lines and shallow folds of ground. Once the morning haze lifted, silhouettes stood out against the flat horizon. In that kind of landscape, moving first usually meant being seen first and fired on first. Russia leaned into its traditional method of massed armor, trained since the Cold War. Pile tanks forward in density, accept losses, and trust momentum to punch a hole. It was a playbook the Ukrainians knew was coming, and one they could not meet head-on. Instead, they set ambushes, relying on hull-down positions and surprise to flip numerical weakness into advantage. For Ukrainian crews, the choice wasn't tactical flair. It was survival math. Trying to maneuver tank for tank on open ground against heavier waves meant almost certain defeat. But ambushes can erase disparities. Think of a handful of riflemen waiting in alley shadows for a patrol to pass by. Clever positioning turns fewer guns into a trap. For armored units, the tactic is called going hull down, burying the bulk of the tank below a rise or behind cover so only the turret peeks above. That small strip of steel can return fire while minimizing exposure. Reports place Leopards and other defenders in hull-down and covered firing positions in the contested area. To advancing crews looking through dust and distance, fields appeared bare of any hidden threat. What they missed was reach. Precision optics and trained gunners could scan those corridors long before Russian tanks recognized what waited. The moment a few first shots rang out, entire columns had seconds to interpret the danger. So how did a smaller force turn that density into a liability? The answer is in sight, stabilization, and how the crew use them. Coming up. But before that reveal, understand what those first strikes meant tactically. Armored mass depends on pace. The formation trusts that leading elements keep rolling so pressure never relents. But halted tanks at the column's head disrupted the entire surge. Vehicles behind closed in too quickly. Space collapsed. And the rear pressed forward without clarity. In minutes, what started as a clean line of advance crumpled into a compressed knot, easy to target from prepared positions. Russian planners, counting on momentum instead, inherited confusion and traffic jams under fire. Quantity, once assumed to dominate, struggled inside that kill zone. The defenders hadn't brought more tanks, they had brought better timing and positions. What cut into the advance wasn't an ocean of firepower, but carefully placed strikes that robbed the offensive of cohesion. Reports note those first exchanges shifted initiative almost immediately. Leopards, hull down and watching through stabilized optics, turned what seemed like exposed ground into a lethal trap. And yet, it wasn't only the ambush itself. What defined the fight was the machine behind the gun. The way its systems gave crews fractions of a second that multiplied into battlefield control. That edge, built into the Leopard's design, is what set the stage for everything that followed. Inside the Leopard's kill zone, the contest wasn't about more armor or larger engines. It came down to what crews could actually see, how quickly they could lock a target, and whether their shot would land on the move. That is exactly what the Leopard 2's design prioritized. Thermal imaging, a stabilized Rheinmetall 120mm gun, and the EMS fire control suite that allowed accurate target acquisition across several kilometers, even under battlefield stress. Thermal sights gave Leopard crews the edge of vision through haze, smoke, and rising dust. Where other optics blurred, heat signatures stood out. The system also enabled what NATO doctrine calls the hunter-killer technique. Commander scans while the gunner fires. No pause, no downtime between targets. Stabilization added another layer. The gun barrel stayed steady regardless of dips and jolts in the terrain. From a hull-down position behind a ridge, crews could peek only the turret above cover, acquire and fire without losing alignment. Contrast that with Russian armor. Many of their vehicles fielded older sighting systems with limited low-light performance. At dawn or in smoke, image quality degraded. Moving across uneven ground shook lenses off target. Dust shortened effective range. Compared with Leopard optics, Russian systems were slower and less reliable under pressure, which translated into seconds lost at each step. Spotting, identifying, adjusting, firing. And in tank warfare, those seconds can spell the difference between survival and wreckage. Think of it as the gap between a sniper with night vision and riflemen fumbling at shadows. One side sees shapes with clarity and heat outlines in detail. The other strains through blur, never certain what is ahead. That was the practical battlefield difference. The Leopard magnified whatever training the crew already had. A commander could hand one target after another to the gunner. Each tracked and lined up in sequence faster than Russian crews could complete a first fire cycle. This advantage shaped the battlefield geometry. While Russian tanks pushed in long columns hoping mass would carry them forward, Leopard crews already had firing lanes mapped and could engage lead vehicles while the column was still rolling into view. Terrain that looked bare to advancing eyes was, in reality, pre-sighted ground ready for precision fire at ranges of 4 to 5 kilometers when conditions aligned. Documented assessments confirm that Russian mechanized pushes in that sector met heavy losses. Public reporting, such as that from the Institute for the Study of War, describes stalled assaults and repelled advances with significant equipment left behind. What the records cannot confirm is neat kill counts assigned specifically to Leopard 2s. Those claims remain unverified. But the pattern was plain. Intended breakthroughs turned to confusion when the forward edge of the column was cut apart. The sequence often played out the same way. The first shots destroyed or immobilized the front vehicles. Fire then shifted to those in the middle. A long armored surge turned into a jam, with rear units pressing forward into wreckage and smoke. What Russian doctrine meant as shock effect became a traffic snarl under fire, an unplanned bottleneck that exposed even more of the column to attack. This result wasn't random and it wasn't magic. It was a structured mix of superior fire control technology and trained crews using it as intended. Optics gave them longer sight lines. Stabilization gave them true firing on the move. and doctrine drilled them to exploit both in a fast, repeatable rhythm. Crucially, Ukrainian Leopard crews weren't improvising miracle shots. They were executing coordinated ambushes built on NATO fire control methods and combined arms planning. As observers noted, it was the blend of system and soldier, optics plus human judgment, that produced the outcome. Still, none of this happened in a vacuum. Equipment mattered, yes, but it mattered most when paired with a clear understanding of how the enemy was likely to advance. That was the real key waiting beyond the optics. Knowing the Russian playbook, anticipating its movements, and setting firing lanes where those formations were most vulnerable. And that calculation is where the story turns next. Exploiting the Russian playbook meant understanding where the enemy would move before they ever crossed the line. Ukrainian crews in Zaporizhzhia faced a doctrine drilled into Russian armored units for decades. Shock tactics built around concentrated pushes. Dozens of vehicles surging forward in one dense formation, counting on sheer weight to overwhelm defenses. Officers were trained to keep armor tight, roll through gaps, and let artillery and infantry press from behind. The flaw was its predictability. When waves always come in the same shape, the terrain itself suggests where to set the trap. Ridges, open corridors, and narrow choke points all became ready-made ambush sites. Ukrainian defenses didn't just rely on gut instinct. They layered Leopard 2s into coordinated kill zones designed to dismantle those pushes step by step. Past operations and battlefield assessments show Leopards working alongside artillery, with drone spotters feeding precise targeting data. The tank delivered the first strikes. Artillery extended the range. Drones kept eyes on the reaction. It was systematic. Positioning, optics, and coordinated fires multiplied effect. Picture how the sequence played out. Lead vehicles rolled into range. Within seconds, they were hit, blocking the front and disrupting the pace. Artillery then struck at the rear of the column, closing off retreat. The middle section, suddenly trapped between burning hulks, had no clear direction to move. That narrow window of paralysis was the moment defenders prepared for. Turrets locked, firing lanes pre-sighted, every round landing into a force now frozen in confusion. The collapse wasn't only mechanical, it was psychological. Crews inside immobilized vehicles faced smoke, fire, and jammed radios. With blocked exits ahead and behind, hesitation spread. Training built around momentum failed the moment momentum vanished. Immobilization and confusion became force multipliers, stripping away all initiative from the attackers. Independent assessments captured the results clearly. The Institute for the Study of War reported that Russian assaults in the sector were repelled with significant losses. These weren't propaganda claims. They were sober operational notes pointing out that an armored thrust never reached its intended mark. Brutal firepower had been neutralized by defenders who read the doctrine, shaped the battlefield, and struck in sequence. Leopard 2s were often at the sharp edge of that defense. They broke the leading rhythm, forcing Russian armor into stalled knots, while artillery and drones added weight from above and behind. It wasn't one platform acting alone. Coordination was the true advantage. Once Russian vehicles bunched together, every asset in the defensive package could concentrate fire on compressed targets. Density became vulnerability, not strength. That exposed the irony of the Russian playbook. The doctrine assumed that massed armor and rigid advance would carry the attack through thin defenses. Instead, its very rigidity turned columns into fixed targets. Predictable patterns handed initiative to Ukrainian crews who understood where to place guns and how to time fires. The assault wasn't beaten by numbers. It was broken by anticipation and by defenders exploiting every habit of their opponent. This set the stage for the claims that rippled across social media. Did those ambushes really translate into 25 Russian tanks destroyed in just 48 hours? The so-called 25 kills in 48 hours story became one of the most repeated claims from the Zaporizhzhia fighting. It spread fast because tidy numbers cut through battlefield chaos. A figure like that sounds clear, decisive, and dramatic. Exactly the kind of shorthand headlines love. But the numbers don't hold up under scrutiny. The specific 25 in 48 hours tally is unverified. Analysts confirm Russian armor took heavy losses, yet no independent source attributes a precise count to Leopard crews alone. Here's what the record actually shows. Russian forces did launch a mechanized assault west of Orikhiv and near Molotokh-Machka, and reports from credible institutes note that it was repelled with substantial losses. The defenders, including Leopard units, were active in the fight. What no assessment confirms is that Leopard 2s, by themselves, destroyed exactly 25 vehicles in 2 days. Attribution breaks down once you leave numbers behind and step into real battlefield conditions. Independent OSINT trackers like Oryx use firm standards. Something only goes on their list if there is visual confirmation with geolocation. A wreck has to be tied to a picture or video in a known place. Even then, trackers rarely assign cause. They log that a vehicle was destroyed, not whether it was hit by a tank shell, artillery, an anti-tank missile, or a drone strike. Without a captured impact moment, you just can't know. Platform-specific tallies fade in the crossfire of layered defenses. That's why you should be cautious when you hear single-round numbers. A brigade might claim it knocked out 20 enemy machines. Social media spins that into 25 in 2 days. The number gets trimmed for rhythm, repeated without detail, and suddenly builds the weight of fact. But battlefield reality is murkier. Commanders sometimes inflate numbers for morale. Reporters latch onto simple counts that fit headlines. And once those numbers start circulating on Telegram or X, they harden into storylines that few stop to dissect. Video, too, isn't a trump card on its own. You will see wreckage strewn across roads and fields, but video and social posts alone don't equal proof of who did what. For verifiable data, you need documented impact footage, clear visual ID, and geolocation that links the hit to the platform. Without those receipts, you can't move from "something was destroyed here" to "Leopard gunners accounted for exactly this many." It's not about doubt for doubt's sake. It's about keeping distinction between evidence and narrative. Compare that to the way the Institute for the Study of War reports outcomes. Their phrasing is careful. They confirm Russian attacks were blunted and losses were high. They note Ukrainian defenders held lines under armored pressure. But they stop short of tying the results to Leopard crews with a fixed number. That restraint isn't a weakness, it's a safeguard against oversimplification. It reflects the fact that multiple systems, often firing together within minutes, created destructive overlaps that can't be teased apart neatly. So, what can you rely on? Multiple sources agree Russian forces lost significant equipment. Leopards were active in the defense. Their thermal sights, stabilized guns, and trained crews added precision fire into kill zones that disordered the assault. All of that is well supported. What you cannot rely on is the exact figure of 25. That remains anecdotal and unsupported by independent verification. The key takeaway is this: the 25 kills in 48 hours story is unproven. True in spirit because Leopards plausibly played a major role in breaking the assault. False in detail because no record confirms a precise body count for their guns. The message stands even without clean numbers. What mattered most wasn't the tally, but the fact that advanced optics and disciplined crews broke the momentum of massed armor. And that gives you the real conclusion. Quantities may grab headlines, but capability decides battle lines. What the clash near Zaporizhzhia showed is that battles are decided less by raw totals and more by how systems are used. Verification gaps remind us not to lean on unproven tallies, but the evidence is clear. Advanced optics, stabilized guns, and disciplined crews broke apart momentum that massed armor alone could not sustain. On modern battlefields, clarity of sight and deliberate employment matter as much as numbers. If this analysis matters to you, like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from and why this matters. Want a follow-up? Tell us below if you'd like a breakdown of Leopard variants and which features count most at the Ukrainian front.